Thank you. And thanks to Adam for quite a challenging presentation, which I think illustrates more than anything the complexity of these cases and the amount of work involved in actually tracing, well, the offender, but ultimately, and as importantly, if not more so, the children. There is a context to what I'm going to talk about, so I'm very grateful for being asked back. But I did talk a little bit about this topic at the last Mary Collins Foundation meeting as a workshop, and it stimulated a lot of very passionate discussion, and a lot of the discussion revolved around children's rights. And this was in the context, to some extent, of the law in the US, which gives every child, once they reach the age of 18, the right to know whether or not, if they have had abusive images taken of themselves and downloaded, to be informed. So this is the larger context, and it was really quite a passionate debate about this. So what I want to talk about touches upon that, and what we had intended following that meeting was to involve Suzanne Ost and Alistair Gillespie, who've written a paper that I'm going to use as a platform for some of what I'm going to talk about. But unfortunately, COVID arrived and it didn't work out the way it did, we had anticipated. So I'm, in a way, using their material. They're talking about a particular scenario in relation to victimhood. But I want to expand that because I think that there are challenging and maybe ethical dilemmas for all of us in relation to how we work with victims. And I'm using work in the broadest sense there. So the paper by Ost and Gillespie was called To Know or Not to Know, and should crimes regarding photographs of their child's sexual abuse be disclosed to now adult unknowing victims? So they have quite a narrow focus in this. I would say, just as Adam did, I'm clearly not going to be putting up any content that's illegal, but the nature of the content can be quite uncomfortable and distressing. So I just need you to be mindful of that. So we start with Ost and Gillespie, and they are going to kind of weave their way through all of this presentation, as you will see. So they start in their paper to ask you, and I'm asking you to do this now, to imagine the following scenario. During their investigation of crimes related to abusive images, law enforcement agents successfully identified the very young victim, a toddler, who features in the images. The images are historic, and the victim is aware of the images, and there is no evidence, to suggest that the victim is aware of the images, and because of their very young age when the crimes were committed, they may remain unaware of the actual abuse. Now imagine that that victim is you. Would you want to be informed of the crimes and the existence of the images? Now, this is a really critical question. I think it's interesting that Daniel, very much the focus of their engagement with the children in this particular case had to be followed up on in terms of the exploration of the extent of the abuse. But in fact, the children were not the target of the operation. The role of law enforcement, of the police in this particular incident was to secure the protection of the children, and the children were not subsequently interviewed nor made aware of how these images are being used. And this is an interesting one, as you will see as this unfolds in terms of how we actually manage these cases and the differences in the ways that these cases are managed. And I'm looking at my watch and I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to start with one case that I was involved in Scotland called Operation Granby. And it was an online grooming case. And there was one offender who had been identified, and they'd been identified, interestingly, because of disclosure of a child who he had met online and subsequently sexually assaulted and she was a young child. She was a young girl with a learning disability. She was a minor, and she was frightened that she might be pregnant, and that's how the disclosure came about. But so in this case, there were 235 young people who were under 16 when they were in contact with the suspect. And he used three or more of a number of aliases with these particular children. So efforts to trace these contacts resulted in 66 people in the UK and 21 overseas being identified. So the word people is used there, but these at the time were now young adults who are now over the age of 18, but they had been minors when the events took place. So all the cases involve the production of CSAM. And we're going to pick up on this because you might, if you're being objective about this, he did not, in the majority of the cases, oh, forgive me, in the majority of the cases, I'm now completely got that wrong. In the majority of the cases, he did not actually create the images, although, I'm sorry about that, although to some extent he coerced his victims into creating content for him. In the case of the sexual assault where the child was frightened she might be pregnant, he'd photographed all of that assault. So when contacted by the police, the majority of these young people denied that there was any abuse. They denied any knowledge of what had happened. And even when, now, question mark over this, it did not happen in all cases, but in some cases, in some police forces, the police actually told them that images had been identified. And in some instances when that happened, the child was, well, now a young person, told the police it wasn't abuse, and they didn't want to give evidence. Not going to make any more comments about that, but there'll be some kind of issues that relate to that that will kind of recur and unfold. I promised to stop going through these slides too quickly. Okay, I think all of this, all of what we're going to talk about would suggest that you know, we've made some progress over the last 20 years. It's more than 20 years since I've been working in this area, and it's the same for Tink as well. So we know that there is some progress, and we know that children have been quite vocal in wanting content taken down. We know that current messaging on online safety and beliefs of victims maybe is problematic, and it may lead to the one that's down here, victim blaming. We know that there are issues around disclosure of images to children who are actually unaware of their existence. And we know that lots of professionals working in this area are quite either lacking awareness in some cases, or professionally quite uncomfortable in pursuing this topic when there is maybe an opportunity to actually listen to a child. Overall, we have very few longitudinal studies. There's one particular study that's been run in the Netherlands called the Amsterdam case, where they are actually following children who have been abused, whose images were shared, to look at the long-term impact of this as they develop. And these are all quite young children. And ultimately, we still have very, very little by way of evidence-based interventions with young people. If you look at the NICE guidelines, the most that you will see is reference to using trauma-informed care. It's not discussed how that can be adapted to meet these children's needs. And I think what is important is that these children do have needs over and above the trauma of any abuse that took place. I'm going to start by really kind of wanting us to think about what we actually know about children in these images. And the starting point for me here, simply because I think it's one way of trying to think about what we know, but it's also maybe, it raises additional ethical issues in terms of what we may see, what we actually use in our databases and how it's used, and what that might mean for young children or young people. And I'm going to make reference to a publication by ECPAD called Trends in Online Child Sexual Abuse Material. And they were looking initially at mapping existing databases. So these are databases of both identified, and as you will see, not always identified children. So what identified means, some of them are image databases and some are databases of identified children. But we'll come back to why I hesitate over the identified children. So we know that Interpol houses and maintains the ICSI database and also the ICANN database on behalf of the International Hotline Organization. And Europol also hosts and maintains IVAS. That's a database of material seized by law enforcement agencies across Europe or in additional countries where there's third-party agreements. And then you've got another one, Project Vic, which is at hash, which is data that relates to the image and associated metadata for materials seized and held in the US. And I'm hoping you're starting to think, why have we got all these databases? We've got an example of a national one is NICMEG, but its brief goes beyond its use of their database to inform law enforcement agencies across the world. And NICMEG is the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. They act as the clearinghouse for seized material within the USA. Contributes significantly to NGO and industry hash sharing platforms. So it's intelligence sharing platforms that are using these unique identifiers for images. So that extends beyond the US. And the InHope one is another hash database, and that's the one that's stored at Interpol. And the ICSI database, again, it's a database of children from 54 countries. Europol are connected to the database. But as you will see, we also have national databases. So we do in the US, we have in Australia, we have in Canada, New Zealand, and across Europe. Are there any issues with this? Well, I think one, and there's also CADE in the UK, which is a database of illegal images and videos of children, which is used to aid law enforcement. And it also helps collaborative working across law enforcement and helps streamline in terms of forensic reports. So this is matching again against content that has already been identified. So we've got lots of databases. I think there are kind of challenging issues in terms of why we have so many databases. These databases, some do connect with each other, but invariably they do not talk to each other. So you will have duplication of content, you will have duplication of information. And there are issues there in terms of the ethics of the databases, not in terms of their function and use, because they are used by law enforcement, but their overall proliferation, and we've been talking about this for quite some years. Now, who feeds into our knowledge and our understanding of how children are victimized are clearly some of our hotlines, and the one that I'm just going to use here is the Internet Watch Foundation. I'm using their most recent report from 2019. And this tells us something about both public reports about content online, but it tells us also about what analysts are actually finding in this online environment. The Internet Watch Foundation data, along with the data from other hotlines, including InHope, is really very important. If we think about what we know in terms of these children, a lot of our data is drawn from these kind of joint public reports, but also the kind of analysts active seeking out of content on the web. In this last report from the Internet Watch Foundation, they have done this for 2 years. They didn't do this beforehand, so this is relatively new. I think they've tried to, in some ways, give a face to many or some of these children, not literally, but to make it, I think, a little bit clearer what it means to be victimized in this sort of way. And this is Becky's story. 11, 12-year-old, they see her and they identify with her. If you look at the language here, she's got a plait or a ponytail, she's got green eyes. But what Becky is doing is that she's looking at the comments and messages written to her at the bottom of her screen. So she films herself either in the family bathroom or in her bedroom. It's clear to the analysts looking at this live streaming or the images that have been captured from the live streaming that she's been directed by somebody or many people on the other side of the live stream. And she pauses and reads instructions before she actually follows and does what is asked of her. And it's clear that she's not alone because there's a noise heard off screen and she jumps and looks nervously around. And the concerns around live streaming again, the terminology is very difficult here because it looks as though there is something here about victim blaming, and in fact there isn't. But the concerns about live streaming are that in a coercive situation, it is likely that the coercion will be used to persuade children or to cajole children, or sometimes even just to suggest to children that they produce sexual images of themselves. And as you will see, these images are problematic for us, for all of us, including particularly the children within these images. So the Internet Watch Foundation recent report, it just illustrates from these figures that the number of children identified year on year, or the number of images that relate to children identified year on year, is increasing. The largest number of children are within this kind of pubertal and pre-pubertal make up the vast majority of these images. Younger children, there are far fewer of those, but as we will see, these images are particularly problematic for us for a number of reasons. And in some ways, this was also illustrated in the case that Adam talked about as well. So, Internet Watch Foundation again, sex of victims. This is the case across the majority of the data that we have on victims. And there are maybe issues that relate to the methodology that's used here, but the majority of the victims in terms of 2019, 92% are girls. So there's an increase over time in the number, in terms of the Internet Watch Foundation, the number of girls are identified in these images. And the severity of the child sexual abuse, as you can see, 2019, 20% of these images would be in category A, which is the Sentencing Advisory Council guidelines, showing sexual activity between adults and children, including rape or sexual torture, including self-penetration. So these are the images that are very similar then to the videos that Adam talked about in relation to this case that was identified. And again, I'm just going to touch on very briefly, this was a study that was done with the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children on their database. And just some of the summary results that related to this were that there were two sets of data. So one was a longitudinal set, kind of historical data, was that over time, what you've seen in the NCMEC data is a trend towards more seriously abusive sexual content over time, more cases involving explicit sexual conduct in later years. No obvious trends within their data set in terms of child victim age or gender. In the cases that involved a single victim and a single offender, they also looked at whether cases were actively traded or not. And actively traded means that they were showing up in submissions to NCMEC on more than 5 occasions. So cases that were not actively traded were still online, they were still available, but they were not being sought after in the same sort of way. And what's disturbing is that these actively traded cases, the cases that were being moved around between offenders, were associated with much more serious content in terms of sexual activity. And they were more likely to involve familial offenders. And while most of the cases involve male offenders who were unrelated to the child, cases involving female offenders, younger children, or more egregious content, more serious content, were likely to involve familial offenders. And again, Adam and I hadn't talked about what we were going to present before this, but we have a kind of a clear indication from the case that he was talking about, where there was very serious forms of sexual harm being inflicted on these children, and maybe a larger group of children. And this was family. He was part of their family. This was the sexual activity scale that we used, that it was in part drawn from the scale that's used by NCMEC, and also using some of the kind of levels on the SAP scale that were drawn initially from the coping scale. So you can see the most kind of serious content included penetrative sexual activity and sadism or bestiality. But the grim reality to all of this is that not all children where images are identified, not all children are identified within those images. And I'm going to just look again at a study that was done in collaboration between Interpol and ECPAT, who are an NGO. And they took from this, the ICSI, the International Child Sexual Exploitation Database, a kind of a sample, so a first sample of over 1 million media files. And they found that the largest number of media files, by way the largest group, depicted unidentified children. So don't forget, the majority of us, me included, always thought about the ICSI database as identified children. So this study is about the children where the images have been identified and have been entered into the database, but the children have not actually been identified themselves. What you can see here again, well, largest number are girls. We don't know why there are more girls than boys identified. We don't know whether that's an artifact of the identification process or differences in patterns of disclosure. We have no idea. What we know is that in 35% of the media depicted at least one male victim of abuse or exploitation. And when boys were depicted in the abuse, it was more likely to be quite severe forms of abuse or involve paraphilic themes, so themes involving other deviant sexual interests. Ethnicity is a problem for all of us in terms of how we make sense of this. Less than half of the world's population live in countries that are connected to the ICSI database. So this may account for these findings, but these findings exist across most of our samples. And that may be because most of the samples are being drawn from high-income countries, but they don't correspond to the demographic characteristics of most of the countries in the developed world. So we've got 76.6% are white, and 2 smaller groups, Hispanic children, Asian children, make up 20% between them. But we have very few Black children there. And we don't know why that is the case. Similar distribution from the kind of the NCMEC database. We've got the largest group is prepubescent, with many fewer infants or toddlers. And the younger the victim, the more severe the abuse was likely to be. And very young children were more likely to be subjected to abuse and exploitation, featuring, you know, this other deviant behavior. and 84% of the videos contain severe abuse. So coping scale was a 10-point scale, which was reduced to a 5-point scale for the SAP guidelines. So we're talking about the most extreme end of these abusive practices. And we've just taken, we haven't just, a few years ago, we took a sample working again with the NCA, SIOC Command and Interpol. We took a sample of the cases identified from the ICSI database that were claimed in the UK. So there were cases where the origin of the case was in the UK. This dated from 2006 to 15, and all cases related to an individual child or young person rather than an offender. And what did we find? So we had 687 cases where we had sufficient information there to be able to meet the criteria for this particular study. Again, maybe not surprising considering what we've seen across the other databases already, is that of these cases, 2/3 were female and 93% were white Caucasian children. So only 7% of the children within the claimed cases were from other ethnic minority groups. 44% were self-taken images. So think back to what I was saying about the IWF report, where they are increasingly concerned that the images that they are finding, a large proportion of these relate to images where a child has been persuaded. In some instances, we may not find the evidence of persuasion, but where the child has been the person who has actually produced this content. So in this instant, the majority of these self-taken images were seen within a coercive relationship. So we would see that as being an online grooming cases. And the next largest category, 26%, were produced by family members. Again, from what we know about child sexual abuse, that shouldn't be really very surprising for us. So within this sample, children under 7 in the images were more likely to have images taken by family members. And again, that may relate to something like access. In the age group 7 to 11, the majority of the images were taken by family members or people who were close to the family. So other adults who were family friends or sometimes peers. Children between 12 and 17 were more likely to have self-taken images in a coercive relationship. And of all the children who had engaged in a non-coercive self-taking images, and they were cases where we could not prove, we could not find evidence of the involvement of somebody else, which does not mean to say that there wasn't somebody being very coercive in terms of this image production, but we couldn't find evidence of that. But they were in the oldest age group. Okay, going back to the paper that I started with, Ost and Gillespie suggest that there are many ways in which a victim may be identified, and these victims may be aware. So you might have an individual who is aware that their abuse was photographed, recorded, and disseminated, so they're aware of the process of that. But there are also victims who are aware that their abuse was photographed or recorded, but not that it was disseminated. They don't know that it was shared. They do not know that others have access to it. There are also victims who are aware that they were abused, but have no idea that that was photographed. If you remember back to the video that we showed, or that I didn't show, that, that was shown to you, the young person within that, a lot of the photographs they were not aware had been actually taken until later on. So they were photographed by somebody kind of photographing their bathroom or their bedroom windows. And we also have victims who were abused at a young age, totally unaware that the sexual abuse took place and that these images were created and disseminated. And in fact, the focus of this particular paper is really on this final category. But I think there are issues that extend beyond that. So all of those scenarios involve CSAM. And it's about trying to tease out what makes them different. What is it about them that's different? And that's a picture of Collier and Svedin, who both Tink and I have worked with over a long number of years. They did some of the earliest work on children who were abused and photographed, and the images shared. And the earliest work in this field, in fact, still has, well, it resonates today. So there is a common consensus over key aspects that differentiate online victims from children abused and exploited offline. And they're linked to things that are maybe intuitively obvious to us. A perceived lack of control over the disclosure process. What we have here now are images of abuse taking place. No longer are we dependent on a child disclosing or an offender disclosing what happened. There is visual evidence and sometimes textual evidence, and sometimes both visual and audio evidence with videos of a child being abused. There is complete loss of control. Who will see that? Both who might see that because they're using those images in an offence-specific way to gain sexual arousal, or where the images are being used to actually identify them. There are feelings of shame and absolute complicity. It looks as though somehow the child is compliant. An inability to find closure because there is a persistent existence of these images, and a potential for re-traumatization or re-victimization when being asked to confront the evidence. And again, I know that Adam was at pains to say that that didn't happen in this particular case. But it does happen in some cases, and it certainly happened in this early Swedish data. And they produced a short book, still worth looking at, I think, and really asking, why did nobody tell us? Why didn't they disclose? And again, referring back to Adam's case, there was no disclosure there. The children didn't say anything. Svedin and Back identified that there are really children who can't tell. They can't tell maybe because they just were not of an age to know what was happening to them, or to have a cognitive or an emotional framework to understand the nature of their experiences. There are children who don't tell. There are children who experience a traumatic crisis, and the crisis itself is problematic in terms of being able to disclose. And there are clearly also cases of memory loss where children cannot remember. They may be aware of something, but they cannot remember. And there are deliberate attempts to forget. And can't we all identify with that? There are sometimes the pain of remembering is just too great, and we attempt to forget. I want to give you, and I promise I'm nearly at my end now, a story of somebody who I saw, it's a number of years ago now. It's somebody I met and I interviewed. As part of a research project, but I think her story is quite interesting, and it's different to what we were being asked to look at in terms of very young children who do not know, who will not understand, but it still has resonances in terms of the video that we just saw, even though this person is a lot older. So I've called her Sharon. When I met her, she was 36, she was married, she had a 3-year-old daughter. And when the police got in touch with her, asking if they could talk to her about an old case they were investigating, she knew exactly what this was about. And she had been dreading this ever happening. So 2 police, a man and a woman, called round to the house when her husband was out and explained that they'd arrested a man as part of a suspected paedophile ring, which had operated 25 years ago. So she was much younger. He had disclosed on being arrested that one man, and he provided a name, would bring his daughter to a flat that they used, and they would be allowed to undress and touch her and ask her to masturbate to them. And she was 11 when this started, but she'd been sexually abused by her father for many years before this and had some very vivid memories around the actual abuse itself, some of which took place in public settings. Where nobody seemed to notice what was happening. Some of the activities associated with this ring, this paedophile ring, included trips over to Amsterdam, where there was a firm that made videos of explicit sexual imagery by adults with children. These images were distributed. Now, as soon as she could, Sharon left home. Her relationship with her mother was poor. She cut her ties with both parents, had no further contact with her father. She survived with a job working in a shop. She was living in marginal accommodation in a house with others. She never, ever told anyone what she'd experienced. And when she eventually met the man she was to marry, she felt that she'd got over that part of her life. It was ending. She compartmentalized it. When she never got in touch with her parents when she married, and though she found it quite difficult to trust people and get emotionally close to her, she felt that this marriage was a step into a new life. When her child was born, she experienced problems looking after the child, particularly washing her and changing her nappies, and she wouldn't let her husband do this. But they managed, they got by. After the police called and asked her to give evidence, she went through a difficult time and engaged in periods of self-harm, something that she'd not done since she was a teenager. She was very fearful that if her husband knew what she had done, he wouldn't want to be with her. She also felt frightened that these old videotapes had been discovered and that the police would see what she had done and what had been done to her. I found that case both disturbing and very distressing, but very moving as well. Her story is not unique. Her reaction to it maybe is different than we have seen in some cases. And I think this is important to acknowledge that her experience of this is not shared by everyone. But we know that from some of the survivors studies that we have, and there are very, very few, this one taken from the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, where they had 150 people who responded to a survey which was targeted at people who had been abused and where their images had been uploaded and distributed. So 71% of these people were aware of images created at the time of the abuse. The images impacted on the disclosure because, again, the same themes coming out here: additional shame, fear, feeling of responsibility, fear that somebody would look at the images and having blocked it out. 46% denied the images, had denied to others that the images had ever existed because of shame or fear of not being believed. And the main reason for not disclosing was the fact that nobody had ever asked them. And we've got another study here that came from US. It was another online survey that was hosted by Facebook. Within this sample, nearly half of the respondents reported that they felt that the production of these sexual images caused specific problems that were different from the problems caused by other aspects of the abuse. Nearly half of the sample worried all the time that people would think they were willing participants or that people would recognize them. 1/3 refused to talk about the images and 22% denied that there were any images to others. So the qualitative analysis from this data identified 3 major themes from these survivor perspectives as adults: a feeling of overwhelming guilt and shame, an ongoing sense of vulnerability, and for some, an empowerment dimension to the images that the images sometimes brought. And I think this is an important thing to acknowledge, because certainly within the work that had been done by the Canadian Centre and some of the people that they had worked with, there is now a group of women who've been supported by the Centre who have been actively campaigning for the recognition of the harms done through image production. And I think this is a very different stance than you would have seen in the case that I presented of Sharon. So, to finish, right, the paper that I started with is really about the ethical, the kind of practical, the whole issue around whether or not children should be informed of the fact that their images are being shared. And certainly the particular paper is focusing very much on children who've never known that their images were created. But I think there's still resonances here for us, right? So they've suggested, and they use a language here which is really particular to what they're talking about. And if anybody wants and can't get a copy of this paper, please do email me. I'm more than happy to send to you. But anyway, they talk about that the matter should be framed as one involving unknowing victims' interests in knowing and not knowing. The discussion that followed the last workshop was very much an issue around child rights, the right to know. They argue in this paper that they're using a concept of spatial privacy. So a victim's spatial privacy would always be violated by unsolicited disclosures, because revealing the existence of the information affects their control of personal information. It takes away their facility not to accept information about themselves. That seems quite complex. And they're saying, in contrast, the existence of autonomy-based foundations for these interests is more contentious, because unknowing victims cannot exercise any meaningful choice regarding information of which they are unaware. Once a person is told, they can't unknow. They can't give a permission to know what it is that has never been known to them before. I'm going to finish on that point. And I'm sorry that that is quite